22. Buddhist phraseology in relation to Christian teaching. We teach the Chinese the Christian religion by means of their own language, and in their vocabulary of religious terms many words and phrases of Buddhist origin have come into common use. The Syrian inscription, AD 781, shows that no scruple was felt by the first Christian missionaries in China in adopting many Buddhist terms. We find there mo, devil. This is the common word used in Mo-Kuei. Both name and being are of Hindu origin. The delusions of the devil are called Mo-Wan. Hell is called Palace of Darkness, and Fu. The Ship of Mercy conveys the faithful disciples across the sea to heaven. The ship is Tsiheng. Heaven is Mingkung. Christian monks were called Seng, from the Sa-limit Sangha, assembly. A monastery is called Si, as by the Chinese Buddhists. A monk's robe is called Kiasha, which is the Sanskrit word for gown, Kashaya. Buddhism throve in the Tang dynasty. It was the era when Huayan Sang went to India. His journey was an instance of the depth of religious faith which characterized the Chinese followers of Gautama in his age, and it also secured an immense increase of popularity to the ideas of his sect. Buddhism was very powerful in the court, and profoundly influenced the literature. Translations from Sanskrit were made with extreme care, and received from the literati a high literary finish. The influence of Buddhism is distinctly seen in the dictionaries of the time, in the syllabic spelling, in the discovery of the four tones, and the settlement of the laws of poetry consequent on that discovery. The poets and critics of the Tang dynasty were conscious of great obligations to Buddhism, and made scarcely any decisive and persistent effort to check the spread of popular faith in that religion, and the general adoption of Hindu phrases and terms in the language. Han Yu, in his Fokupiao, was an exception. The Syrian Christians extended their missions in China at a time when Buddhism was in the ascendant, and adopted terms from the professors of that religion which indicate a more extensive principle of imitation than either the Roman Catholics or the Protestants have in later times thought of adopting. The reason is found in the popularity of Buddhism in the capital of China in the time of the Nestorian missionaries. That religion was much favored at court, and was the chief agent in teaching the future state and the superiority of the monastic life as a means of subduing the passions. Both Buddhism and Christianity came from the West, and it would be for the Nestorians difficult to maintain the mutual independence of the two religions, agreeing as they did in a belief in a world of happiness and of misery for mankind after the present life. The fact that the Nestorian monks called themselves Seng, as the Buddhists do, has some light thrown on it by an incident in the life of Matthew Ricci. He adopted a Buddhist priest's dress and shaved his head. But after making trial for a time of this costume he changed it for that of the Confucianists, as it was worn in the Ming dynasty. Perhaps the Nestorian priests adopted and retained the Buddhist costume in ordinary life, and reserved their own ceremonial robes for special occasions, as the Roman Catholics do now with the Confucianist. The word Seng, for priest, they probably took to be an exact equivalent of their koan. So in colloquial English, we call the Buddhist monks Buddhist priests. We have given up the word bonzes, the Japanese term introduced by Portuguese and other Romish missionaries, into European accounts of the religion of this part of the world. To call them priests at all is, however, somewhat negligent English. The Roman Catholics have done better to call their monks Siusher, and their nuns Siunu, rather than to style them Seng or Hoshang, and Niku or Niseng. Siu is, cultivate moral virtues, Shur, scholar, person, Nu is, woman. Times have changed. The Buddhists are not now wafted to a proud position by the gales of popular applause. And still less in the present dynasty, than in the Ming dynasty, would the Jesuit gain any advantage by following the example of Ricci while he was in South China, in adopting the Buddhist garb. In discussing Buddhist phrases capable of being applied in Christian teaching, I will begin with Mo, the devil. This is in Sanskrit Mara. The Maras are, in Buddhist phraseology, a class of demons. They are not known to the Brahmins. The word is formed from the root mar, death, and is an Aryan personification of death. By the Buddhists the Maras are regarded as a king with a host of followers. They wage war against Buddhism, and when Shakyamuni was living he had successful contests with them. In Buddhist books all temptations are demons. A demon is hidden in everything that can cause evil to man. The demon of anger prompts to sin in every case of sinful anger. So of lust, of drunkenness, of theft, and each form of sin. The use of mo has become so extended that in our translations of the Bible it is freely used for the Greek delta iota alpha beta omicron lambda omicron, diabolus in the literary and colloquial versions. To Christian converts it gradually assumes a Christian sense in proportion as they are instructed in the biblical representations of the power, agency, and character of Satan. But if not instructed, the views of the convert are Buddhistic. These views are brought into connection with possession, as seen in an intoxicated man, an importunate beggar who cannot be got rid of, an opium smoker who is under the dominion of his habit, or a scholar who cannot cease from study. Such persons are possessed by a demon who is called Kuei, but in the poetry of the Tang and the Sung dynasties he might be called Mo. A writer is free from the Mo Chang, demoniacal film or hindrance, when his thoughts and language flow freely and beautifully. The main idea is often that of causing trouble by possession. Ju Mo, a demon entering, is a phrase which is quite commonly used to express the idea. To become deluded, to be deadened to, are also thus described. Nanamo or Nankui are common examples of the way in which demons causing trouble is expressed. Evidently it is necessary in using mo for the Christian sense, to distinguish accurately the peculiar meaning of the word in the heathen religions. The Christian Mokwe is more intensely wicked than the Buddhist Mokwe. But both in Europe and in Asia, in ancient or modern times, we nowhere find the demon world dissociated from the phenomenon of possession in popular language. It is one of the primitive identities, permanently retained in the phraseology of all religions. Another common Buddhist expression is, Tiayu, earth's prison. The Sanskrit Naraka, the abodes of demons, places of punishment underneath the world of men, are so designated. The advantage of the employment of this term is that it is ready for use, that it agrees with our word, hell, in being a place of punishment, and, further, that the visible universe being to the Chinese consciousness in two parts, viz. Heaven and earth, it must always be convenient to the Christian teacher to speak of hell as belonging to earth. The objections to its use are great. It misplaces the locality. No modern Christian books place hell underground. It is plural as much as singular, while our word for the place of punishment is always singular. Further, it gives the Confucianist occasion to say that we have borrowed from the Buddhists, and that we must share in the same condemnation which the adherents of that religion have had to endure. The authors who have reasoned against Christianity on the ground of the identity of the doctrine of hell being much the same in the two religions, and that we have borrowed from the Buddhists, are Su Qiyu in Ing Huanqi Liu, Wei Yuan in Haikuo Tiu Chi, and the King of Korea in his edict against Christianity, taken away from the hill fort at the mouth of the Korean River, by the United States Naval Force which captured the fort 11 years ago. The words used for hell in our translations of the Bible are In Fu, the hidden palace, In Qian, the dark world. The natives also use In Si, the place of hidden judgment. Tu is never used in our translations, at least the recent ones. But all missionaries use it colloquially, and it finds its place in our catechisms. These phrases, In Fu, In Qian, In Si, are very modern. They are subsequent to the teaching of the metempsychosis in China. The term used for hell in the Syrian inscription AD 781 is Anfu, Palace of Darkness, a phrase borrowed from the Buddhism of the time, and meaning the same as In Fu. Since the Sung dynasty, the popular notion of hell in China has been formed chiefly by the prevalent representations of the 10 tribunals seen in temples and in the Yuli, probably AD 1068, and other works. Punishments are here depicted in the most frightful forms. The incendiary is bound by a chain to a hot cylinder, which he clasps with his arms and legs. Flames are being poured forth from the top and sides of the cylinder. Those who guard written characters from desecration enjoy honors and wealth. Those who waste grains of rice and millet are seen changed into horses, sheep, and oxen. The retribution corresponds with the sin and the merit in all cases. In the consent of the governing class to those popular representations of hell which we see painted with charcoal on the white walls of temples, or formed with molded and painted figures of clay, or taking the form of prints in popular Taoist literature, we see an important concession. While the literary class do not believe in heaven or in hell, they see the advantage that may be derived from them in the inculcation of virtue. In the hands of the moral teacher, future retribution is a powerful engine for good. This is recognized by the governing class so far, that they encourage the people to have in temples the horribly grotesque and alarming models in clay of future punishment which we see there. The celebrated judge Pao Cheng, of the Sung dynasty, who died AD 1062, is the fifth of the 10 judges. The rest are all Chinese, as we know by their surnames, and probably actual judges of about the same period. The late Dr. Medhust, when visiting Tianmushan, in the vicinity of Hangzhou, was hospitably entertained by the magistrate of the Heian city of Haiyafeng. In the course of conversation he asked his host what he expected would be his lot in the future state. He replied that he supposed he would become a Qinghuangyi. This little circumstance shows how the Sung dynasty practice of canonizing good magistrates has taken hold upon the country, and made the people think a magistracy in the invisible world quite as attainable as a like post of honor in the present state of existence. Often, however, they will, in using phrases of this kind, speak jokingly. Sung dynasty emperors were the first to practice, so far as I know, the appointment of local magistrates for the invisible world, with jurisdiction over particular cities. None of the Sung philosophers lifted up a voice against it. They allowed the upgrowth of the religious usages and arrangements connected with the Tungyou Miao, the Chenhuang Miao, and the Tuti Miao. All of these temples are erected to divinities who are supposed to deal with mankind in the future state in the way of just retribution for their crimes. These and other judicial divinities were elevated to their posts with the assistance of the literary class, who are, however, ashamed to recognize them in their writings. They kneel before them as officers on duty, encourage the people to believe in the reality of their jurisdiction, and avoid protesting against them in their writings. What the literati believe in their hearts to be a monstrous fiction, is to be allowed on account of its moral and political benefits. What shall the Christian missionary in these circumstances do with the native doctrine of retribution? He will assure the people that there is revealed in the Christian scriptures a retribution just, comprehensive, and inevitable. He may allude to the modern origin of the 10 judges, and condemn the Sung philosophers for their insincerity in allowing, if not inventing, this mythological creation. He may proceed to condemn the Buddhist also for teaching that Yama is judge in the invisible world, when, according to their own metaphysics, Yama is nothing. And for urging the Chinese to accept a doctrine of hell punishments which they teach, not as what they really believe, but as a means to an end. In this they set an example of false teaching which the Confucianists were only too ready to accept and imitate. The Christian retribution will come before the Chinese mind on quite a different footing, as resting on the instruction of a divine Savior. But let us be candid in acknowledging the aid we receive from Buddhists in previously spreading far and wide among the people the idea of a moral retribution. For this helps us to bring over more quickly to the understanding of the Christian faith on this point, any of the population who are familiar with the Buddhist teaching. This is the case even with sects like the Shinshu in Japan. That sect professes to believe in absorption into the Absolute. Many Buddhists profess to take the Western heaven as the goal of their hopes. But these beliefs or aspirations are capable of being reconciled with beliefs in the heavens and hells of the metempsychosis, and they are actually taught along with them. Even the most metaphysical Buddhists, and those who have the most abstruse notion possible of the nirvana, still teach as exoteric doctrine the metempsychosis as known in India. That I am not wrong in imputing to the literati who belonged to the later Sung dynasty, and especially Chu Hai, a principal part in the encouragement of the popular belief in future retribution, may be shown by the chronology. The author of the Yu Li, a Taoist named Tan Chi, who was the first to give currency to the legend of the 10 royal judges, lived more than a century before Chu Chi. The two brothers, Cheng Mingtao and Cheng Yichuan, lived a little before Tan Qi, in the early part of the 11th century. The elder died the year before the Yuli was made, the younger lived for nearly 20 years after. Then came the time of Wei Tsung, who is said to have deified Chang Yi with the title Yu Huang to Ti, and who was carried with his son into Tartary a prisoner under the new Qi dynasty. This was the period of the founding of this new Taoist school of a future state, with 10 judicial courts, and with Yu Huang to Ti enthroned as a judge of human actions. Then was the time also that Tsai Huang Shang Ti and Feng Tu to Ti were made divine judges, each with his special court for the determination of the happiness or misery in the future state of each individual man. Chu Fu Tsi witnessed all this and did not protest against it. He saw also rising round him the novelty of the Cheng Huang Miao, with its judicial apparatus, its magistrate for trying cases in Hades, and its array of clay servitors. With arrangements for periodical processions through the region over which he had jurisdiction, for the sake of knowing the good and bad conduct of individuals. He saw these things and made no struggle against the extension of superstition. The worst he said of Buddhism was, that the doctrine of Yang and Mai was better. The reaction against Buddhism, so far from beginning with him, began rather, as I think, with the expulsion of the images of Confucius, which had in the Sung dynasty found their way into the temples of Confucius in cities. This expulsion took place in the Ming dynasty, and in the present dynasty the reaction against Buddhism has been stronger among the literati. But the pictures of the 10 hells have come to be more and more used. It is important to note that Chu Fu Tsi lived in an age when the Taoist images, and the mythology connected with them received a great development, against which he made no protest. Chu Hai ought not to be put forward as the authoritative representative of Chinese thought, and some foreign scholars appear to me to have erred in regarding his views as final, and as the accepted expression of Chinese thought, ancient and modern. In fact, there is scarcely anyone who has been by later writers more heavily condemned. His influence has been great, and it continued long, and some of his works are still authorized schoolbooks. But his authority as a thinker and a scholar, is in the present dynasty challenged and criticized severely by all independent writers, without an exception. It is possible that Chu Hai may have felt that the doctrine of future retribution is likely to be true. He was certainly rather fond of reading Buddhist books. He may not have cared to contradict what was to some extent perhaps true. Let it be borne in mind that in the Book of Odes, he approves of the rendering in a certain well-known passage, the soul of Wen Wang moves up and down in the presence of the Eternal. Scholars not in favor of the continued existence of the soul after death usually explain this away. The term Tiantiang, for heaven, seems to be founded on the use of tang as a hall for holding a court. Heaven is present to the native mind as a vast hall where the deity sits in celestial state with subordinate divinities as his assessors. The phrase is not Hindu, but the idea is Hindu. In other words, the Chinese have made a phrase of their own, to fit the Buddhist notion of a paradise or palace of the gods. The reason is not far to seek. The Buddhist translators, when rendering the word God, used Tian invariably. The Sanskrit Deva, the Latin Deus, and the Bengali Deta, have no other equivalent in Chinese than Tian, heaven. At the same time Devaloka, the heaven of a Deva, is also translated by Tian, thus causing some confusion. This mixture of two senses has led to the addition of tang, in ordinary colloquial use, for heaven as a paradise. This phrase Tiantiang, heavenly hall, is of course modern and subsequent to the spread of Buddhism. The narrow limitation of the word to the sense hall is an objection, but Christians all feel that the chief and prevailing sense is in the word tian. The Christian usage omits tang as often as it admits it, even in colloquial intercourse and in preaching. In the various translations of the Bible, Tiantiang is never used. Tiankung, Palace of Heaven, is not inappropriate for the throne scene in the 4th chapter of the Book of the Revelation, but it is not used in the Chinese versions of the scriptures. Like Tiayu for hell, it is limited to colloquial use in Christian literature. In Buddhist books, Tiantang is not used for heaven, but Tiankung, Palace of the Gods, which is so used, is a good deal like it and resembles Mingkung, bright palace, which is found in the Syrian inscription for heaven. And in late Christian literature occasionally. Mingkung and Tiantiang are both of them phrases formed on the Hindu notion of heaven. Heaven and hell are both embraced in Yin Qian. The invisible world includes states of happiness as well as misery. This reminds us of Homer, where, in the 11th book of the Odyssey, he describes the interviews of Ulysses with many of the shades of the dead, including his own mother. The palace of Pluto and the abodes of the dead were regarded by Homer and his contemporaries as underground. Was not the notion of Tiu, Earth's prison, taken to India from countries farther west? Egypt may have been the parent of the idea of a subterraneous prison of the dead. We find the notion in Egypt, in Greece, in Babylon, and in India, but it is not in the Vedas. It was either originated in India after the Vedic age, or it was then introduced from elsewhere. I prefer somewhat the hypothesis of Western origin, on account of the similarity of the view held of the future state as given in Buddhist books, with those found in the religious books of Western races. We are beginning to find out how fruitful was the Greek mind, not only in inventing, but in communicating the knowledge of inventions. The traces of Greek influence are found in Hindu architecture, in Hindu astronomy, in Hindu arithmetic, and in Hindu philosophy. The Sanskrit writing is now admitted to be of Semitic origin. The Hindu hells which are first found in the Laws of Manu, of uncertain date, somewhere between BC 800 and BC 500, and then in the Buddhist books, and which are intimately connected with the metempsychosis, may have come from Western countries, and subsequently have been elaborated into the Hindu shape. When the universe based on the metempsychosis was in course of construction by the Hindu mind. At any rate, when Chinese critics charge Christianity with borrowing heaven and hell from the Buddhists, we are right in pointing out that the Olympus of the Greek gods, and the Hades of Pluto, Poseidon, in Homer, are more ancient conceptions than the Buddhist hells and paradises. And that, whether it was from Egypt, from Babylon, or from some other source, the borrowing is on the whole more likely to have been the other way. Otherwise, why do the oldest Hindu books say nothing of the earth prisons, and the palaces of the gods? Redemption. Each Buddha and Bodhisattva is a redeemer. I notice here T. Sangwang Pusa. He is called Wu-Wei-Kiau Chu, teacher of the unseen world. Full of benevolence and grace towards mankind, he opens a path for self-reformation and pardon of sins. The phrases here used are such as we employ in describing the Christian redemption. The Buddhist redemption is moral. For it includes repentance, and rescue from the net of the delusions of Maya, partly moral and partly mental, Maya sauce, a juggler, idealism, delusion. It brings the idea of grace before the people. That grace is pity in the heart of Buddha, or some bodhisattva such as Kuan Yin, prompting them to teach true doctrine to those who have gone astray. In the Buddhist books the bodhisattva expresses a wish and proceeds to accomplish it. In the Taoist books, however, the utterance of the wish is attributed to Tsang or Kuan Yin, but the issue of the decree of salvation is ascribed to Yu Huang Ta Ti or Tsa Huang Shang Ti. The love of Buddha is self-prompted, and is the result of a determination entered on millions of years before in an earlier life. It may be doubted whether this self-originating love can logically be claimed by the Buddhists. For they also believe in an impersonal fate which compels the succession of events just as they happen. But it is better wherever we find a moral love like that of Buddhism, being at once the enemy of vice and the friend of virtue, to recognize its existence and assign due credit to it. This being so, it seems proper to say, further, that the resemblances with Christianity are most striking. 1. There is the self-prompted pity of Pusa for mankind. 2. Pusa saves men by instruction, from the punishments in which they will certainly be involved in the 138 hells. 3. The cause of future punishment is sin committed in the present life, Yangqian. 4. The God of the Taoists is represented as promulgating a gracious decree, to remit the punishment of hell for those who repent. Such is the way in which redemption is represented in modern Taoist works, where a Buddhist element is freely intermingled. A mixed mythology and scheme for a fictitious salvation had grown up in the Sung dynasty, and continued to prevail till the present time in works like the Yu Li. In it we see a sort of preparation for Christianity, in the way of familiarizing the minds of the people with phraseology which may be used in describing the Christian redemption in several particulars. The purely Buddhist notion of the Western heaven, and the disciples of the Taoist sect leading the soul to that abode of happiness, are also introduced without scruple in these Taoist representations. I have often thought that the religious pilgrims, pictured with banners in their hands inscribed with the sentence Tsai Sai Fang, we will lead you to the Western heaven, a Taoist priest in front, pencil in hand, ready to write on the head of new disciples met upon the way the sign of initiation to the religious life, might be very effectively used as an illustration to describe the zeal which Christians ought to show in holding aloft their banner in the path of their pilgrimage, and in the readiness which they should exhibit to look out on the way for the victims of sin and error, and induce them to join in the march to the heavenly city. Secret merit. Any virtuous actions are meritorious, and form a stock which may be heaped up like grain in a barn, and constitute a man's treasure of benefits to come. No good action, says the Buddhist, is lost. The spirits unseen will be sure to take note of it. If you do good, there is an absolute certainty that you will receive benefits by way of recompense. Hence the phrase Tiantai Kung, accumulation of secret merit. A curious confusion takes place here, through that mental tendency which sometimes mixes the cause of an act with the event. Merit produces happiness. Therefore the name happiness is given to merit. In Mongolian Buddhism Boyan is both happiness and merit. Etymologically, it is the Chinese fu, happiness, doctrinally, it is any good action. In the ordinary language of social life, it is either happiness or religious merit. In Chinese Buddhism, sui fu means either misery and happiness or sin and virtue. You may translate them either way. Sui is misery, but it is also sin, fu is happiness, but it is also merit. In the ordinary use of shu sui in Chinese, bear suffering is the idea. The conception of sin is lost. This is the effect of Buddhist teaching. The following passages occur: Taiao Tio Sui Fu Chi Quan, leap out of and escape the gate of misery and happiness. Xin Ti Sung Sui Fuin Kuai Jan Singwu, first wake up with a shock from the delusive dream of causes and effects of misery and happiness. The effect of Buddhist doctrine on heaven and hell may be judged of partially by a statement in No. 480135 of the Wankuo Kung Pao. An account is there given by a convert of the Basel Mission, in the district of Sinan, near Canton, of his personal experience, first as a heathen and afterwards as a Christian. After leading a dissolute life for some years, he began at the age of 27 to read such books as Paoing Lu, Yin Chiwen, and Canning Pian. These teach future retribution in the most appalling language when describing the torments of the wicked, and they make use of the most inviting pictures of the happiness of the virtuous. He then read also Ulysses Chuen. He says regarding it, that it speaks of heaven, Tiantiang, as a place of incomparable glory, and of hell, or earth's prison, Tiu, as the abode of misery indescribable. He continues, at this time I was so affected by what these books said, that I felt my very hair and bones grow stiff with fear at the thought of the character of my past life. Coming to myself I looked up to heaven and said, how shall I escape the punishment of earth's prison? My conscience condemned me. Waking and sleeping I could get no rest. I continued to read books exhorting to virtue, and meditated deeply on them. I kept on saying to myself, do nothing wrong, but practice every good deed, or else I thought in my innermost mind about the words, lust is the most deadly of all sins, and filial piety the chief of all virtues. Of these words I made a warning and a rule. Sometimes I presented a written petition to Wen Xiechang Ti Kaiun, declaring my determination to live virtuously. At other times I made it a daily habit to go morning and evening to the image of Kuan Yin and burn incense before it, at the same time reading the book, King, of Kuan Yin, and praying to that divinity to rescue me from my miseries. I also prayed to high heaven, making use of 4 sentences, I strike my head and worship the blue heaven, my ruined life has been marked by thousands and tens of thousands of sins, I pray thee to have pity on me. I beg forgiveness for all past sins. I was so full of alarm, that I was anxious to perform some meritorious act to free me from all my sins. Occasionally also on returning home, I presented incense, and read a prayer to the kitchen god, and was accustomed to take the manual for the worship of the god, and recite passages to various members of the family, exhorting them to compliance with the direction to be very reverential to the kitchen god. I also urged my parents to avoid eating beef and dog's flesh, for the preservation of their good fortune. My desire to be virtuous grew greater as I observed the cheats and craft of the world, and the selfishness and greed of many persons. I was at that time bent on becoming a good man, and superior to others, and so acquiring a variety of high rewards. He then proceeds to show that all this time he was himself deluded in a multitude of ways, and firmly bound in the snares of ignorance, till, by the help of his grandmother, an old lady of 87 years, who had been for years an excellent Christian, he was brought to the exercise of faith in Christ and his gospel. Undoubtedly this is an example extremely interesting and instructive, as showing how the Buddhist doctrine of heaven and hell prepares for the Christian. I proceed to detail the steps of this man's conversion. The old lady had 5 sons, all of whom, except our convert's father and the eldest, followed their mother in adopting Christianity. The opposition of these 2 sons to Christianity continued for years, and the writer of the account was brought up an unbeliever. The grandmother, coming one day to chapel, slipped her foot, and sustained a severe injury. A Christian helped our convert in taking care of her, and in applying his medical skill to cure her. While he was doing this, he plied our convert with exhortations to accept the new doctrine. As he spoke of the coming judgment, and of heaven and hell, our convert felt himself deeply moved. It just suited his mode of fear and of longing. It helped him to make up his mind and give his will a fixed direction, so that he yielded himself to the influence of the new religion and became a secret believer. When his grandmother reiterated her earnest appeals to him to adopt the true faith, he consented. He still felt, however, afraid of calumny and reproach, and confined his praying to the schoolroom where he taught. At last, he says, he felt stronger faith, went to join in worship at the chapel, met the missionary, and was afterward soundly chastised by his parents. He was subsequently baptized, and entered the training institution of the Basel mission. Let attention be given here to the circumstance, that this man, a genuine convert to Christianity, had made an unsuccessful attempt at a moral self-reformation in connection with the Buddhist doctrine of heaven and hell, and the moral teaching inculcated in the universally known Taoist publications, the names of which he mentions in his account. The retribution proclaimed by Buddhism led him to an outward reformation, consisting in the abandonment of a vicious life. At this time he had a glimmering of certain truths, found embedded in heathen beliefs. He had the moral intention leading him to forsake some sins, but he did not achieve a satisfactory escape from doubt and temptation. This could only be the gift of Christianity. Yet, in Buddhism, he had the guidance of a certain light which led him to become a seeker for truth. Christianity found him not altogether cold and dull, but in an inquiring and unsatisfied attitude. He was looking for more light than that of Buddhism, for stronger love than that of Buddhism, for a brighter hope than that of Buddhism. These he found in the Gospel. Not only had the moral teaching of Taoist books and the Buddhist doctrine of heaven and hell a distinctly perceptible effect in inclining him strongly to self-reformation, but the habit of Buddhist devotion, in the form of reciting passages from liturgical books, and prayers for aid to escape from misery, helped him in commencing a quasi-religious life. The petition to Wen-Sia-Chang Ti-Kaiun, a star god, is a written prayer burnt in the incense flame. The prayer to Kuan Yin is an appeal to the powerful divinity, who promises to exercise her delivering power as a pu'sa to every supplicant. The habit of prayer was already formed, when he was induced by faithful Christian friends and relatives to pray to the God revealed in the Bible. When he did so, he begged the recovery of his grandmother, in order, he adds, that she might lead him and his family with her to the hall of worship. His grandmother recovered, and he felt that his prayer was answered. This led him to great earnestness in prayer and strength of faith, for she was confident that the cure took place by the immediate exercise of God's power, and in answer to prayer. His habit of heathen devotion was transmuted into Christian devotion. Christianity takes man as it finds him, and makes him, by teaching and training, a servant of God. I do not in any way doubt that Buddhist doctrines have been, for the Christian teacher, most important preparation for Christianity. And that, through the spread of these doctrines, the Chinese people look upon Christianity with much less strangeness, and accept its doctrines with much less difficulty, than otherwise they would have been able to do. On the other hand, it may be said that Buddhist priests do not easily become converts, that Polynesians, Negroes, unmohammedanized Malays, and the mountain tribes in Burma and India, become converts more readily than the Chinese. This, perhaps, has been so hitherto, but I doubt if it will be so in the future. There have been causes which have operated to check the progress of Christianity in China. They have been chiefly originated by the Confucianists. When opposition from the literati is removed, it is surprising with what ease Christianity can be propagated. One reason of this is, that the minds of the people are impregnated with Buddhist ideas and the language with Buddhist expressions. 23. Notice of the Wu-Wei-Kiau, a reformed Buddhist sect. Interspersed through the village population of the eastern provinces of China are to be found the adherents of a religion called the Wu-Wei-Kiau. They are little known, usually belong to the lower ranks of life, and have few books. Their principles, however, render them remarkable. They are a kind of reformed Buddhists. Their system is more like Buddhism than any other religion, but they are opposed to idolatry. They appear to be strongly and sincerely convinced of the goodness of their opinions, and they hold with tenacity the uselessness of image worship. This circumstance has often attracted the attention of missionaries at Shanghai and Ningpo, and I have thought that a notice of the sect would not be without interest. This sect has existed in China for about 270 years. Its originator was Lo Weineng, a native of Shantung. In imitation of the Buddhist title Tzu, he is called Lo Tzu, the Patriarch Lo. His opinions have spread with considerable rapidity through the adjoined provinces, Qiangnan, Zhejiang, and Anhui, and may advance farther. The name of the sect is Wu-Wei-Kiau, which, translated literally, means the do-nothing sect. The idea intended by it is, that religion consists, not in ceremonies and outward show, but in stillness, in a quiet, meditative life, and in an inward reverence for the all-pervading Buddha. Buddha is believed in, but he is not worshipped. There are temples, if they may be so called, but they are plain structures, destitute of images, and having in them only the common Chinese tablet to heaven, earth, king, parents, and teacher, as an object of reverence. The phrase Wu-Wei, to do nothing, occurs in the writings of the early Taoists, long before Buddhism appeared in China. In the Book of Reason and Virtue, Tao Te King, it is said by Lao Kaiyun, the highest virtue is not, intentionally, virtuous, and on this account it is, deserving of the name, virtue. The lower sort of virtue is, anxious, not, to be, wanting in virtue, and therefore it is not, true, virtue. The highest virtue does nothing, and consequently does not trust to, or rest on, any action. Virtue of an inferior kind, anxiously, acts and trusts to action. This is the controversy that has been so often raised between the contemplative and the active man. In China Confucius and his school are the advocates of activity, and Lao Tsi and his followers of contemplation. These philosophers both discussed the art of government, the one with the aid of idealism, the other under the guidance of, something like, materialism. The phrase Wu-Wei is one of the watchwords of idealistic and mystical schools in China. While Yu-Wei, action, a phrase of opposite signification, is the cry of systems which favor materialism. I give another quotation. It is from the second of the great Taoist authors, Chuang Tsi. The way of heaven, he says, is not to act, Wu-Wei, and therein and thereby to be the most honored of all things. The way of men is to act, Yu-Wei, and to be involved in trouble. When Buddhism entered China, a system much more purely idealistic than Taoism. This phrase Wu-Wei was soon recognized as the equivalent to the phrase Hu-Wu-Tiantai, vacancy, stillness, and destruction, of that foreign religion. The resemblance in principle between Buddhism and Taoism was in this respect too evident not to be remarked. The similarity became still closer when the esoteric branch of Buddhism, established by Bodhidharma, and developed by the Chinese Buddhists who succeeded him, extended itself so much as quite to overshadow the older exoteric branch. External Buddhism seeks after the nirvana, encourages the worship of images, appoints prayers for the dead, and makes use of much outward show to win the multitude. This is Yu-Wei, or reliance on action. The mystic Buddhists resist such a method of attaining the ends of religion. They recommend inaction, or Wu-Wei. It is from them that the Wu-Wei sect has sprung. The name is a favorite Taoist expression, but the source of the religion is Buddhism. Lao Tzu, the founder of this religion, was a native of Lichou Fu, in Shantung. He was introduced, say the books of the sect, to the emperor of the Ming dynasty of the period Qingti. The following account is given of the interview, in the work Lao Tzu Chusher Tuifan Ping Pao Kuan. 100,000 foreign soldiers had invaded China, and an army of 10 times that number had been sent out to repel them. The army failed in its enterprise, and Lao Tzu offered to the commander to drive back the invaders. He shot an arrow into the air, when a lotus flower descended with a loud noise, and the enemy seeing it became terrified and immediately fled. The emperor was informed of this, and Lao Tzu was called to his presence. The emperor thanked him for his success, and asked him how he came to possess this miraculous power. Lao Tzu denied having any supernatural power, and attributed the deliverance of the state to the protection of the dragons and the gods. The emperor then directed him to shoot arrows into the air, when a shower of lotus flowers appeared. The emperor was enraged, and ordered him to be imprisoned and starved to death as a sorcerer. While he lay in captivity, mourning over his fate and reciting prayers to Buddha, a revelation seemed to dart into his mind. He said to his jailer, "I have 5 books to make known to men." The jailer called in Chan Kung to confer with him, who encouraged him to commit his books to writing. He therefore sent for 2 of his disciples, Fa Hai and Fa Pao, to come from the Wu-Tai mountain, where they resided, to act as his amanuenses. 2 other persons, noted in the history of his religion, namely, Wei Kuo Kung and Tang Shangshu, were witnesses of the correctness of the transcript. The 5 works whose origin is thus described constitute the sacred books of the religion. They comprehend the following 6 subjects. 1. Hinkyo Kyuan, which describes painful efforts after emancipation, resulting in perception of the excellence of this religion, chapter of the movement of the feet. 2. Tansha Kyuan, lament over the world. 3. Pesai Kyuan, overthrow of false doctrine. 4. Qingxin Kyuan, inclination of the mind to the right doctrine. 5. Taishan Kyuan, becoming like the mountain Taishan, confirmation chapter. 6. Tsing Kyuan, the mind and nature purified and quieted. These works were presented, continues the story, to the emperor, who recalled the author to his presence and received him more favorably than before. The 3 friends above mentioned, being officers high in rank, interceded for him, and became sureties for his good conduct. At this juncture 7 foreign Buddhists arrived at court, bringing a brass Buddha as a present. Lao Tzu was appointed to hold a discussion with them. He was introduced as the Wu-Wei-Kiau Zhen, religious man who maintains the principle of non-action. The foreign priests asked him why he assumed this name. By means of it, he replied, "I shall be able to overturn your brass Buddha of 3,000 pounds weight today." Men do not know this principle, and therefore they seek for false doctrine. My method is clear and perfect. It is suited for the whole world. To this it was replied by the foreign priest, "Do not use boastful words. I can make a gourd sink to the bottom of the sea and iron tongs swim on the surface. Can you do so?" The foreign priest expects that our hero will not be able to explain his riddle, but he is mistaken. A ready reply is given. Man's nature is like the full moon, which, when it emerges from the horizon, shines to the bottom of the sea, across the surface, and everywhere. To sink and to swim, then, become the same. When my nature, sing, like the moon, shines bright and clear, my life returns to the bottom of the sea. In the view of my spiritual nature, born directly from heaven, iron may swim and the gourd may sink. The foreign priest then asked him why he did not chant books of prayers. He answered that the great doctrine is spontaneous, man's nature is the same with heaven. The true unwritten book is always rotating. 136 All heaven and earth are repeating words of truth. The true book is not outside of man's self. But the deceived are ignorant of this, and they therefore chant books of prayers. The law that is invisible manifests itself spontaneously, and needs no book. The flowing of water, the rushing of the winds, constitute a great chant. Why, then, recite prayers from books? The founder of the Wu-Wei religion was again asked why he did not worship images of Buddha. He answered, a brazen Buddha melts, and a wooden Buddha burns, when exposed to the fire. An earthen Buddha cannot save itself from water. It cannot save itself, then how can it save me? In every particle of dust there is a kingdom ruled by Buddha. In every temple the king of the law resides. The mountains, the rivers, and the great earth form Buddha's image. Why, then, carve or mold an image? I remark here, in passing, that at this point we must consider Buddha as God in the view of these religionists. He is to them that being whose glory and whose acts are seen in every object of nature. But, then, this Buddha is not a personal being, the ruler and father of the world. He cannot be prayed to. He cannot love me, or be the object of my love. When religionists of this class say they see Buddha everywhere, it is only the reflection of the thoughts and emotions of their own minds that they refer to. Again he is asked why he does not burn incense. He replies, that ignorant men do not know that every one has incense in himself. What is true incense? It is self-government, wisdom, patience, mercy, freedom from doubts, and knowledge. The pure doctrine of the Wu-Wei is true incense, pervading all heaven and earth. Incense is everywhere ascending. That incense which is made by man, the smoke of fragrant woods, does not reach heaven. The winds, clouds, and dew are true incense, always shedding itself forth through the successive seasons of the year. He was asked once more, why do you not light candles? He answered that the world is a candlestick. Water is the oil. The sky is an encircling shade. The sun and moon are the flame lighting up the universe. If there is light within me, it illumines all heaven and earth. If my own nature be always bright, heaven will never become dark. It will then be perceived that the king of the law is limitless. It should be noticed that the king of the law is a personification of the doctrine believed. The mind reflects on the doctrine till imagination pictures it to the intellectual eye as a glorious image. This is the king of the law. When the discussion was over, the 7 priests all confessed themselves worsted, and begged Lo Tzu to become their instructor. The book adds that the emperor was highly pleased, and ordered the books of Lo Tzu to be engraved. They were published, continues the record, in the 13th year of Qing Te from the Imperial Press, AD 1518. I met recently with a former adherent of this religion who is now a Christian. He was baptized recently by the late Bishop Russell of Ningpo, of the Church Missionary Society. He gave me much information respecting the sect to which he had previously belonged. He still thinks its principles are good. It enjoins virtue, and its tendencies are, he considers, of an excellent kind, but it does not show how goodness is to be attained. He therefore left it and became a Christian. On asking him the meaning of the discussion before the emperor, and if it was not fictitious, he said that the army of foreign invaders means the sensorial organs, the 6 thieves, as they are called by the Buddhists. The arrow shot in the air is the heart. The foreign priests who oppose the true doctrine are moque, demons. This use of fiction to recommend religious dogmas is in keeping with the usual character of the Buddhist books. Unlimited license is taken by the authors in inventing a suitable tableau of characters and scenery, in which the doctrines to be taught may be prominently represented. Two other persons, Ing Tzu and Yao Tzu, have, at different periods, taken the lead in this sect. Ing Tzu is said to have discoursed on Fa, Dharma, the law, as Lao Tzu did on King the books. There is another personage beside Buddha spoken of by these religionists, the Kinmu, Golden Mother. She dwells in a heaven called Yao, to shake, Chu, to dwell, Kung, palace. My informant considered that she represents God, in the idea of this religion, more nearly than Buddha does, because she is an object of worship. On my inquiring why this divinity should be female, he said that Kinmu was the mother of the soul, as the female parent was of the body. Yen Chu Kung may be Jasper Pearl Palace. She is said to protect from various calamities, and is prayed to for deliverance from sickness, and to save the deceased from miseries in the unseen world. The origin of her name is found in the Chinese theory of the elements, among which kin, gold, metal generally, stands first in order. This and many other Taoist notions are blended with Buddhist principles in the system maintained by the followers of the Wu-Wei-Kiau. They have 4 principal festivals, of which 2 are to celebrate the day of the birth and death of Lao Tzu. The others are the New Year and the middle of the 8th month. On these occasions, 3 cups of tea and 9 small loaves of bread are placed on the table by appointment of Lao Tzu. The number 9 refers to the strokes of the Pakwa, or 8 diagrams, in which 9 is the most fortunate number. The bread is called Kegon, heaven and earth, also in imitation of the names of the 8 diagrams of the Book of Changes. The sect is sometimes called Chai-Kiau, tea sect, and Mantiu-Kiau, bread sect, in consequence of the usage here mentioned. These appellations are, however, nothing but popular nicknames. They have in their chapels, tablets to the emperor and to the 5 names of honor, heaven, earth, prince, parents, and teacher. They are strict vegetarians, and argue tenaciously for the metempsychosis. They have no ascetic institute like the Buddhists, but allow the family institution to be undisturbed. They were persecuted in the Ming dynasty. One of their leaders was crucified by nailing on the gate of a city in Shantung. On one occasion, some persons of this sect addressed me in a missionary chapel in Shanghai, with the remark that their religion resembled the Christian in this respect, that one of their leaders was crucified. They have not since been subjected to persecution, but their religion is still prohibited, and its name is found among those charged with teaching depraved doctrines, in some editions of the Sacred Edict. My informant told me, further, that the doctrine of the non-existence of matter is not held by this sect, though it might have been expected from their close adherence to Buddhism that they would have maintained it, but that they simply regard all material things as perishable. When the world comes to its end, the Golden Mother will take all her children, i.e., all believers in this religion, home to the Yao Chu heaven. The Wu-Wei-Kiau is usually spoken of by the Confucianists as a corrupt sect, with secret political designs, but its adherents appear at present to be entirely innocent of any illegal aims. They are, so far as can be seen, intent on religious objects, and sincerely attached to their system. We may yet see many of them exchanging abstract philosophical dogmas for Christian truth. Their opposition to idolatry is a preparation for Christianity, and they deserve great attention from those who are engaged in teaching the Chinese the religion of the Bible. They are very determined vegetarians. When they become Christians, they prefer to free themselves from the bondage of the prohibition by eating some small quantity of animal food, as a proof to others of their change of religion. This is entirely voluntary on their part. In the vicinity of Shanghai, a few years since, this happened in the case of a florist and his wife. The wife was a woman of influence and decision. She signalized her change of religion by inviting friends to a feast and partaking in their presence of a certain portion of animal food. 24. Buddhism and Tauism in their popular aspects. By the popular aspects of these two religions, I mean their aspects at the present time, in as far as they exercise an influence on the popular mind. They were popular formerly in a sense different from that in which they are popular at present. Thus, Preaching was common among Buddhists in the early ages of their religion. The principal duty of a shaven monk was to explain the doctrine of Shakyamuni as a deliverance from the misery of life. At present the popularity of Buddhism certainly does not rest on any activity in expounding the doctrines of their faith that we have the opportunity of witnessing. It rests rather on the supposed magical powers of the priests, on the merit believed to attach to gifts presented for the support of monks, monasteries, and liturgical services. And on the widespread belief that such merit will be followed by all kinds of happiness. The early books of Buddhism abound in beautiful moral precepts, proceeding from the lips of a man who, through a long life, was animated by a pure and lofty asceticism. They are tinged with a proud scorn of worldly glory, and with a firm consciousness that there is nothing so good for a man as to listen to the teaching of his own better nature, while he shuts his ears closely to the siren voices of all sins and all temptations. Assuredly this is not what makes Buddhism popular now. For these early books are never, or almost never, read in the liturgical services. And as to striving to be good, the Buddhists do not act so as to indicate that this aim is vital and vigorous among them. The sharp eyes of the Confucianists are upon them, and the judgment they pass on them is unfavorable. The Confucianists represent them as drones in the community. They describe them as not like the useful silkworm, which gives to man the material of the textile fabric, but as being like the moth, which destroys that fabric. Then, why is Buddhism still believed by the people? The answer is, that they believe in the magical efficacy of Buddhist prayers, and in moral causation, or, in other words, the law of moral retribution which Buddhism teaches. It is on these accounts that money flows into the Buddhist treasury for the erection and repair of temples and pagodas, and for the support of innumerable priests. If I give money to gild sacred images, the law of causation will give me back happiness, in quo piume. The history of Taoism has been similar. What has come now of the philosophy of Lao Kaiun and Chuang Tzu? It is much too abstruse for the modern Taoist mind. The Taoists of the present day do not occupy their attention with mysterious speculations on the pure and the true. Nor yet do they give attention to the alchemy of the Han dynasty. They have ceased to experiment on the elixir of life, or the transmutation of all metals into gold. Instead of this, they occupy themselves with writing charms for driving demons out of houses, and with reading prayers for the removal of calamities. When you meet a Taoist of this generation, you do not meet with either an alchemist or a philosopher. The man you see claims, however, to be able to do very great things. He will undertake to drive out a demon from the body of a madman, and from a haunted house, to cure the sick by magic, and to bring rain in time of drought by his prayers. He will protect by his charms the quiet citizen and the adventurous traveler from all sorts of dangers. And, when there is mourning in the house, he will, like the Buddhist monk, hire out his services to read passages from the liturgies of his religion, which shall, by their magic power, quickly transfer the soul of the dead to the land of happiness on high. A Chinese writer says in a characteristic way, the three religions differ in their doctrines. Yet as to the aim, to save mankind, they are at one. In Buddhism no personage holds so large a place in saving mankind as Quan Shirin. In Taoism there is no one equal to Lu Chunyang. In the Wu-Wei-Kiau there is no one to be compared with Confucius and Mencius. In this extract, 137 Kuan Yin is represented as more prominent in saving men than Buddha himself. Such is the modern development of Buddhism, and it is the popular Buddhism of the day. Kuan Yin was introduced into Indian Buddhism not long before the Christian era. In China, Kuan Yin was worshipped probably in the Han dynasty, but was not so popular as afterwards. A modern change has taken place in the image of Kuan Yin. Down to the early part of the 12th century, Kuan Yin was represented as a man. In a book of drawings of the time of Sun Ho 138 and in the works remaining of famous painters of the Tang and Sung dynasties, Kuan Yin is always a man. In later times it has become the custom to represent Kuan Yin frequently as a woman. This has been the custom for about 600 years. Kuan Yin is in masculine costume in temples where great attention is paid to precedent, but the popular taste is in favor of a goddess rather than a god. Hence the appellation in English, Goddess of Mercy, founded on the phrases commonly applied to her, Tatiesi tape kio ku kio nan, great mercy, great pity, salvation from misery, salvation from woe. That one of the many metamorphoses of Kuan Yin should have become a very common, in fact the most common, image of this divinity, may be taken as an indication that, in deifying ideas, the Buddhist mind in China delights to assign feminine attributes to that of mercy. It is easy to understand how the Sung Tsi Kuan Yin, or Kuan Yin, the giver of sons, should become extremely popular. The salvation of mankind by teaching is a conception very characteristic of Chinese Buddhism. This belongs to all those fancied personages called Fo and Pu Sa. For example, the mission of Kuan Yin is the salvation of men. It is symbolized by her 32 metamorphoses. In these shapes she enters various kingdoms as a savior. Among these representations are seen the 84,000 arms and hands with which she guides the ignorant and the lost. The doctrines taught by Kuan Yin are the non-existence of matter, and the infiniteness of the knowledge and mercy of Buddha. All evils are summed up in ignorance. To acquire knowledge of the emptiness of existing things is to become saved. It is this that is meant by the salvation of men through the agency of the Goddess of Mercy. In accordance with a vow she assumes some one of her 32 shapes, and proceeds to the various kingdoms of the world to convert men, and to the regions where gods, giants, demons, and fairies reside, to protect, instruct, and save all. Kings, governors, and people are renovated by the power of mercy. They are said to lose their fear, to be extricated from the thrall of delusion, to become perfect, and to have the power of aiding themselves or others. Kuan Yin is represented as being able, by uttering charms, to assume numberless shapes for the sake of saving. She saves by mercy, by wisdom, by entering into a state. She obtains the great self-reliant power by which she can ensure that those who pray for sons and those who pray for the state of samadhi shall attain it, and those who pray for deliverance from dangers, or for old age, shall also secure them. She is able to give nirvana to her petitioners by the same power. This is said to be her great mercy and pity. All the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas have powers analogous to these. But none are so prominent, perhaps, in this respect, as Kuan Yin. Manjusiri, Wenshu, whose seat of worship is Wu-Tai Shan in Shan Si, is, even in North China, where his worship most prevails, much less thought of than Kuan Yin. Probably Puhien, the seat of whose worship is Wamei Shan, in the province of Sichuan, is even less esteemed than Manjusiri, and a fortiori than Kuan Yin. It would seem, then, to be a fact important in modern Buddhist history, that the most popular of the divinities of this religion should be presented first with male and afterwards with female attributes. And that the change of sex in the images should have been accomplished within the last few centuries. Yet it should not be forgotten that Kuan Yin is, properly speaking, to be regarded as masculine even at the present time. The feminine form is a specially popular metamorphosis. If we wish to go further back and to be still more careful in our analysis, Kuan Yin is but a form of Buddha, coming into the world of suffering mankind in a lower position than Buddha, in order more effectually to instruct and save the ignorant. Thus Puhien and Wenshu are in the same way said to be ancient Buddhas appearing among men as the two helpers of Shakyamuni, who styles one of them Changtsi, eldest son, and the other Xiaonan, little boy. Wenshu is the god of wisdom, and Puhien of action. Wenshu rides a lion, and Puhien an elephant. The lion symbolizes boldness, bravery, and a fresh, eager, and advancing spirit. The elephant indicates care, caution, gentleness, and a weighty dignity. This is Buddhist symbolism. It is interesting in itself, because it explains the images. The object of the images is partly instruction, and partly the awakening of devout feelings in the minds of worshippers. The image of a Fo or a Pu Sa is intended to combine in its appearance wisdom, benevolence, and victory, the wisdom of a philosopher, the benevolence of a redeemer, and the triumph of a hero. All perfections are collected in the holy image: perfect power, perfect virtue, infinite compassion, infinite boldness, and infinite knowledge. These are intended to be represented in the images. This symbolism is, however, not exactly what excites faith and devotion in the rich supporters of the Buddhist religion. It is rather a belief in the magical power of the Buddhist divinities and priests, and confidence in the doctrine of retribution for the bestowment of liberal gifts. Priests are invited to perform a liturgical service for the dead. It is called kung ti, merit. Its object is to give the deceased a better position in the next life than he would otherwise enjoy. This is founded on the metempsychosis. Souls may be reborn in a better or worse state of existence. The magical power of Buddha may exalt a man from a birth into hell to a birth into the world once more. Buddha's power may cause a poor man to be born in the next life as a rich man. The choir of priests wield this power. They profess to have the power to cho tuling one, save the soul. This means to transfer the soul from an undesirable abode in the next life to a very happy one. The people believe that the priests, by beating cymbals and drums, knocking the wooden fish and chanting prayers, can redeem the deceased person from the punishment due to his sins. This is expressed by the phrase, shu sui, redeem from guilt. For a service of 1 day in the house of the dead person, the name tso kung ti is used. For a service of 3 days, paisiation is often used. The favorite name, much may be learned from favorite names. Omitu Fo tells of an expected paradise. It speaks of the longing for a happy hereafter. Here Buddhism has abandoned the legitimate nirvana of Shakyamuni, and preferred to allow the people's craving for immortality to dominate the philosopher's dogma of a return to the Absolute. A favorite title of Omitu Fo is Tsayin Fo, the guiding Buddha. He guides from earth to the western paradise. The legend of Omitu is connected with that of Kuan Yin. The school which teaches it is called that of the Peaceful Land. In China and Japan this school has always been a popular one. It is so especially in Japan. I was much struck while in that country with inscriptions on tombs. A large number of the inscriptions in ordinary cemeteries indicate that the person there buried died in hope of being taken to the Peaceful Land. It is different in China, where Confucianism has prevented Buddhism from taking a firm hold on the hearts of the people. No such inscriptions occur in Chinese cemeteries. Japan has been more thoroughly penetrated with Buddhism than China. Yet in China the funeral procession for the dead bears many marks of Buddhist influence, though the ordinary cemeteries do not. Thus the one fan, or soul's banner, carried before a coffin in such a procession has on the top a lotus flower, and below 3 strips of cloth, the middle one of which contains the characters Pan Yi, which imply faith in the departure of the soul to the western heaven. The portrait of the dead, Shen Shang, is placed beside it in what is called the Tsoting. Below the portrait is a tablet to be worshipped. On the right hand is another banner called Ming Tsing, on which are recorded the titles of the deceased. Now it will be noticed here that the wooden frame like a baldacchino holding the picture is Buddhist. It contains the stool on which a Buddhist monk sits cross-legged when living, and on which he is placed sitting in the same attitude when dead. 5 Buddhist priests and 5 Taoists read prayers at the grave of persons who are rich and high in office. The liturgies read are such as the Sin King, Heart Classic, and the Kuan Yin King. In reference to use in funeral processions, these liturgies are called 20 Sai King, Liturgy for turning, or guiding, the coffin, on its path to the grave. The nirvana is too abstruse for the popular faith. It has been replaced by the paradise of the western heaven. The belief in the existence of hermit heroes, and of various malevolent spirits and demons, is a marked characteristic of popular Taoism. Haunted houses are avoided in all parts of China. The power of expelling demons from haunted houses and localities is believed to belong chiefly to the hereditary chief of the Taoists, Chang Tianchi, and subordinately to any Taoist priest. To expel demons he wields the sword that is said to have come down, a priceless heirloom, from his ancestors of the Han dynasty. All demons fear this sword. He who wields it, the great Taoist magician, can catch demons and shut them up in jars. These jars are sealed with a charm, fu. I have heard that at the home of this chief of wizards on the Dragon and Tiger Mountain in the province of Kiangasai, there are many rows of such jars, all of them supposed to hold demons in captivity. The wizard himself is believed to be a power. The charm is a power. The sword he wields is a power. The efficacy of a charm is increased by the supposed magical gifts of the Taoist wizard from whom it is obtained. To secure the services of the great Kiangasai wizard is very expensive. Only the wealthy who can expend 1,000 taels of silver without being pinched can afford the luxury of feeling quite sure that, by the agency of this wizard, the demons who trouble them are completely subjugated. The residence of this wizard is called Qinzhen Fu. In giving him the title Qinzhen, the meaning is that he is regarded as having attained perfect power and virtue. He is the ideal man. Men under the domination of the passions are not called Qinzhen. The Taoist discipline gives a man the rule over himself and over nature. He who possesses this is called a true man. The word Qin, true, cannot be fully translated into English in such cases as this without embracing the ideas real, perfect, ideal, and most elevated. It is higher than seen, immortal, but not so high as Sheng, holy. The present chief wizard is like his predecessors. His wife belongs to a Kiangasai family. Taoism in the persons of its wizards retains marriage. Buddhism introduced the disuse of marriage. Taoism, being anterior to that much more ascetic and self-denying system, knew nothing of celibacy. It may be asked, from whence came the wizards and their charms, and their supposed power to subdue the bad influences of demons in disturbing neighborhoods by apparitions and uncanny noises, and in causing sickness and death? It may be answered, that before the introduction of Buddhism, but especially in the Han dynasty, this folly was rife in the popular belief, and has continued so till now. There were wizards in the Shang dynasty, but no details remain of what they did. In the Han dynasty, the wizards stand out in their completeness. They were greatly honored by prince and people, and have continued to be so in the person of the Chang Tianshi till the present day. This personage assumes a state which mimics the imperial regime. He confers buttons like the emperor. He has about 30 persons constituting his courtiers and high officers. Taoists come to him from various cities and temples to receive promotion. He invests them with certain titles, and gives seals of office to those Taoists who are invested. They have similar powers to his, and can, for example like him, subdue demons by pasting charms on doors, which prevent them from entering. The Chang Tianshi, in his capacity as a sort of spiritual emperor, addresses memorials to Uti in heaven. His position will be understood from this circumstance. He is chief official on earth of Yu Huang Ti in heaven, and as such is in the habit of addressing to him memorials, called piao. His duty is defined as the driving away and expulsion of demons by charms, and their destruction by the magic sword. In all parts of China, the charms seen pasted on the doors of houses testify to the dominant idea of popular Taoism, and to the universal fear of demons, which Taoism encourages. Certainly it is not Confucianism that maintains in rigor this absurd dread of evil spirits wandering through the air, disturbing the public tranquility, occasioning alarms which sometimes spread like an epidemic from city to city, and leading the uninstructed populace to trace fevers, madness, ague, drowning, accidental death of travelers, suicide, and any sort of unaccountable discomfort, to the imaginary agency of invisible and malevolent beings. To subdue them is the office of the Taoist magician. The person honored with the credit of having invented the charm is Chang Taoling. It was called Fu, because written on bamboo tallies such as were anciently used by officers of government, and which are made to fit in shape one with another as a security against imposture, in accordance with the meaning of the verb fu. They are to be seen pasted on door lintels, the occupants of the house believing that the sight of the magical characters written on the charm will prevent evil spirits from entering. The magicians were in the Han dynasty called, not without a touch of sarcasm, the feathered scholars, Yushi, as being able to fly. The legend of Chang Taoling, ancestor of the Chang Tianshi, head of the Taoist hierarchy at the present time, is sometimes stated as follows: in the latter part of the 2nd century, this Pope of the Taoists, if he may be so called, was engaged in the province now called Cchuen in the Homing Shan mountain where the crane Sinho calls, in manipulating the elixir of the dragon and tiger, Lung Hu Tan. He met a spirit who said, in the Pi Sung mountain is a stone house where may be found writings of the 3 emperors and a liturgical book. By getting these you may ascend to heaven, if you pass through the course of discipline which they enjoin. He dug and found them. By means of them he was able to fly, to hear distant sounds, and to leave his body. Lao Kaiun then came down to him on the night of the Feast of Lanterns, and ordered him to subdue the demons of the Shu country, Cchuen, in order to confer blessings on humanity. Lao Kaiun gave him a powerful and secret charm, Lu, liturgy, king, a composition in verse or measured prose, Q, sword, Qian, and a seal, Yin. After going through 1,000 days of discipline, and receiving instructions from a certain goddess called Yunu, who taught him to walk about among the stars, he proceeded to fight with the king of the demons, to divide mountains and seas, and to command the wind and thunder to come and go. All the demons fled before him, leaving not a trace behind of their retreating footsteps. On account of the prodigious slaughter of demons by this hero, the wind and thunder were reduced to subjection, and various divinities came with eager haste to acknowledge their faults. In 9 years he gained the power to ascend to heaven and prostrate himself before the first in rank of the 3 pure ones. A temple in Cheng too is said to have been the place where Lao Kaiun discoursed to Chang Taoling. He afterwards went eastward, and settled his residence on the mountain Lung Hu Shan, where his descendants have ever since resided in possession of great honor and emolument, as his hereditary representatives. The present occupant of the patriarchate had to fly at the time of the Taipianji rebellion, and the temple where he resides was partially destroyed. The repairs of the buildings are now nearly completed. The popular divinity, Yu Huang Shangtiai, is an ancient magician, exalted to this dignity probably by the Taoist writers of the Tang dynasty. 139 in the Penhing of the Taoist collection it is said, that a magician of the Chang family was the son of a king in a former Kolpa, who, instead of succeeding his father, became a hermit, and after 800 Kolpas, and much patient endurance of injuries, attained to the rank of the Golden Immortals, Kin Sin, and at the same time a Buddha with a special title, Tsing Tsing Tsi Janchia Julai, the pure, calm, and spontaneously perceiving Julai. After 1,000,000 more Kolpas he became Uti, or Yu Huang Ta Ti, Emperor of all the Immortals. In the same way, Tsi Wei Ta Ti, God of the stars round the North Pole, is the emperor who rules over the presiding gods of all the stars, according to the one account. The magician Chang and the magician Lu mounted dragons and rode up through the sky towards heaven, and Chang gained in the race. In the Qin dynasty, AD 300, Chou Hing is reported to have died and risen again. He is said to have related what he saw when dead. He saw Tiantai, the heavenly emperor, enter the chief hall of his palace. Clouds, purple in color, dense and dark, obstructed the view above him. His face was a square foot in size. Chou Hing was told by those on his right and left, "This is the heavenly emperor Chang." His palace is the Utsng Kung, which is represented in temples by a building beneath the abode of the 3 pure ones. It is the heaven to which the soul flies, and Taoist prayers are supposed to help the dead to reach the Taoist heaven. The expressions are, 1 Fei Ca Chung Xiao, the soul flies to the high firmament. Ling Tiang Tien Kung, the soul ascends to the heavenly palace. These passages are the earliest I have yet found giving the family name Chang to Uti. This magician or god Chang is to be distinguished from Chang Taoling as already described, ancestor of the present Chang Tianshi, and from the medical divinity Chang Xin, who was, in fact, a distinguished physician of the Sung dynasty. The personage called Chang Xin, in common Chinese paintings, with bow and arrow shooting at the moon, is this physician who lived about 700 years ago. In the tail-cutting delusion, which died out in 1879, after spreading over the country like an epidemic, we see an example of Taoist ideas. The fairy that cuts off hair is checked and prevented by a charm. A written charm curled up in the plaited queue at the back of the head is a protective shield against all the assaults of witchcraft. Taoism attempts to soothe the fears of the people by this artifice. In Peking lately I myself heard that a writer of charms hired men to go along the streets shouting to people that for safety they should place charms in their hair, and detailing cases of the loss of queues in the night. Or while men were sleeping in the daytime. These hired men brought to the writers of charms a great increase of custom. Every one wished to buy one. There must be something in it, for every one talked of it. We must, they said to themselves, buy a charm. The charm used in Peking against the danger of waking without a queue, consists of 4 mysterious characters, which are all found in Konghai's dictionary. They were, we are there told, used against a similar delusion in the Ming dynasty. The Taoism of today meets us with this special characteristic. Yet it is but one part of the popular Taoism, which in great part consists of a monastic institute for reading liturgical books after the Buddhist fashion. Dr. Yates says, in his lecture on ancestral worship and feng shui, that Buddhism borrowed from Taoism. But, in fact, it is rather the other way in the main. Buddhism indeed borrowed from Taoism the worship of Quan Ti, as it has borrowed from Confucianism the use of ancestral tablets for the worship of the priests of a monastery. But there is no room for doubt, that the general program of the arrangements of a Taoist monastery, with the occupations of the inmates, is Buddhistic. The whole scheme of prayers for the dead is so. As to prayers for rain, they are essential in China in every religion. For popular and for state reasons it is necessary to have them, the reason being the same in all Buddhist countries. When therefore the Hindus and other Buddhists came to China, and found prayers for rain already existing in the Confucian, the imperial, and the popular worship, they would in offering prayers for the same object be only doing what they were accustomed to do in their own country. They can scarcely be said to be borrowed by any religion. The popular character of the prayers of the Taoists for the dead is different in some respects from the Buddhist, but in the chief features it is evidently imitated. The old classical word tsiu, for example, is not used in describing the services of the Taoists for the dead. The phrase pai chen is used. One is called chotn chen, or prayer of looking toward heaven. Another is yu huang chen, prayer of yu huang. This word Chan is Buddhist. The object of reciting these books is to save the souls of the dead by affording them a speedy ascent to the palace of Yu Huang. The hell of the Buddhists is repeated by the Taoists in their descriptions of the future state. The variety of torments and punishments to be inflicted on criminals in the next world may be seen with all the harrowing details in the temples of Tungyo to Ti, the god of Taishan, a mountain god who is supposed to rule the underworld. He corresponds in attributes somewhat to T. Sangwang Pusa, the Buddhist deliverer from hell. Like this Buddhist god, he rules only as a savior and shares his authority with a large group of inferior divinities, whose offices as ministers of punishment to those who deserve chastisement, are illustrated on the walls by rough paintings. Or by clay images, molded and painted in the Chinese method, in the temples of Tungyo to Ti. Among statements which I made years ago and have now to correct as imperfect or erroneous is this, that the Taoists have no hell, but only a heaven. In fact they have both, for the rough wall drawings and clay moldings found in the east and west buildings of the temples of Tungyo prove it. These are not, however, many centuries old, and they form a part of the mass of legend and myth which they have unscrupulously borrowed from the Buddhists. Yama, god of death, in India, the Yanluang of China, with the 10 courts of judgment which rule over the guilty, sentences them to punishment and has it administered after death. This forms the basis of the Taoist hell. Modern Chinese art is very much pervaded with Taoist ideas. The 8 genii meet us everywhere. The manufacturers of porcelain, bronze, and carved bamboo ornaments are never weary of representing these 8 personages. They belong to the class of hermits. The love of external nature was very much developed in the Tang dynasty. Poetry was the favorite occupation of the literati. They gave attention to no severe studies. Every beautiful spot among lakes, waterfalls, and mountains was selected for a hermitage or a monastery. Buddhism and Tauism received a wonderful expansion. It was just the era for the legends of the 8 genii to spring into existence. It was an age of sentimental feeling. The great national poets flourished in the same dynasty as the 8 Taoist hermits. Li Taipi and Tu Fu gained their fame at the same time that the 16, and afterwards 18, Lohans became popular. These Lohans are the Buddhist equivalents of the fairies and hermits of Taoism. The 16 were Hindus, while the 2 added names were those of Chinese Buddhists. All the 8 genii were Taoists of the Tang dynasty. We see the effect of Buddhist and Taoist teaching in the present race of Chinese. The Taoist religion especially is responsible for those superstitions which have a dangerous character. The epidemic of the fairy powder was fatal to the peace of communities. The absurd charges brought against the martyred Sisters of Mercy in Tianjin were based on ideas which, although usually represented as popular, and as the native growth of the Chinese mind, are in fact correctly placed to the account of Taoism. It is dangerous to the state that religious teachings should be encouraged which tend to foster and originate popular delusions entailing such frightful results. Every man, whether a Christian or not, ought on moral grounds, and on the greatest happiness principle itself, if he thinks that is a safer basis, to desire the extinction of a religious system which encourages dangerous and lying delusions. Then there is the tail-cutting. The Taoists accept and endorse the whole system of popular delusion which originated the tail-cutting. They believe in the existence of just such fairies as are said to cut off men's queues. They make money by selling the charms which are represented to be a protection against such demons. Popular Taoism then is worthy of decided condemnation, from every Christian and every enlightened lover of mankind, whatever be his belief. There are beliefs in the Taoist religion which not only need to be attacked by books written from the Christian standpoint of thought, but which may very properly be condemned in the proclamations of magistrates. On account of their tendency to produce dangerous tumults and lamentable breaches of the peace. What a field is here presented for the teaching of science, and the spread of a practical system of improved education in China. Dense intellectual darkness clouds the people's minds. There is pressing need for the extension of a system of education which should strike at the root of superstition and enable the rising youth of the country to avoid falling into the thrall of those delusive imaginations which have grown up under the fostering care of the Taoists during the last 200 years. It is a great misfortune for a nation to have an extensive sacerdotal caste, whose interest it is to continue, generation after generation, the belief in deceptive fancies which check the free growth of true ideas and all healthy habits of thought. Their livelihood depends on the people continuing to believe in demons, fairies, and charms. The missionary and the schoolmaster, the magazine and the newspaper, are all needed to check these bad influences, and replace dangerous and injurious popular notions, by healthy and useful knowledge, to he gathered from God's 2 books. That of nature and that of revelation. Then as to the effects of Buddhism, it may be said to have been good in some respects. It bears a consistent testimony to the vanity of the world, and the essential and immense superiority of soul purity to earthly grandeur. But in founding on this a monastic institute, it has followed a wrong plan, and failed to attain the purity desired. It teaches the need of a personal Redeemer to rescue from the moral evils attendant on our present existence. But this Redeemer is a Buddha or a Bodhisattva, a man or being possessing none of the powers attributed to him. Among the prominent and most pernicious evils for which the popular Buddhism of the present day is responsible is idolatry. It is an enormous evil that Buddhism has placed the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the position in the reverence of the people, that ought to be held only by the Creator and Father of the world. Idolatry puts fiction in the stead of truth, and, as we every day see in China, renders the mind indifferent to truth. This, too, is a vast evil. Confucianism makes everything of morality. And the worship of Buddhist images, when it is complied with, becomes a moral duty on the part of the emperor or the magistrate, only because it is ceremonial duty, not because the Buddhist religion itself can have any just claim to it. But Buddhism, by putting forward the image, debases and misleads the national mind, by drawing it away from the proper object of human worship. Our great contest as Christian missionaries is with Confucianism. There is found the intellect, the thought, the literature, the heart of the nation. But we have also a preliminary struggle with Buddhism and Tauism. These constitute three mighty fortresses, erected by human skill and effort, to impede the progress of Christianity. Confucianism is the citadel of the enemy, raising its battlements high into the clouds, and manned by multitudes who are animated by a belief in their superiority and their invincible strength. The taking of this fortress is the conclusion of the war. But Buddhism and Taoism each represents a fortress which must also be captured and destroyed. So far as argument and intellect are concerned, these fortresses are weakly manned. But think of the numbers, the millions on millions, who are deceived by these superstitions, and held fast by chains of spiritual darkness. Let the Christian host of soldiers press on, and detail its battalions, first to overthrow these strongholds of rebellion against God. And when they are destroyed, let another earnest effort be made to destroy the last and strongest of the towers of the enemy. Then, when all these three fortresses are overthrown, and China becomes a subject kingdom under the Messiah's peaceful reign, it will be the greatest triumph ever achieved for Christianity since the time when the Emperor Constantine became a Christian, and the Roman religion and power and the Greek philosophy were dragged as captives behind the car of the victorious Redeemer. 25. On the use of Sanskrit by the Chinese Buddhists. The Chinese characters have been written in the same form and with the same sort of pencils since the time of Wang Haiqi, AD 350. During these 15 centuries, while the writing taught in all schools has been unchanged, the sounds attached to the characters have been in a state of slow and constant flux. Thus, the translator Kumarajiva wrote his name with 4 Chinese characters then called Kumalazip. They are now Kyo, or Chiu Emolosher. All sonant initials, such as G, D, B, Z, ZH, J, have changed in the interval to certs, viz. K, T, P, S, SH, CH. In words pronounced with the tone called hiaping, the aspirates K, T, P, CH come in place of K, T, P, CH, which occur in words pronounced with the tones hiaping, hiachu, and hiaju. Final M has changed to final N. Finals K, T, P have been dropped, also the vowels have all changed their values, A to O, Y to E, U to U, and K. The compilers of Konghai's dictionary have provided tables of the old sounds, with characters chosen to represent the pronunciation as it formerly was. They are to be read with the powers of the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. Natives not knowing the Sanskrit letters cannot escape from the confusion in which they are involved by the difference between the old and new pronunciations. The foreign student will find that the principle here laid down is a key to unlock the difficulties of the subject. The following examples will help to familiarize the learner with the method. Sanskrit, Old Chinese, New Chinese. Buddha, but, Fo. Amogavajra, Emoja Bajare, Omokia Pachelo. Upasaka, Upasaka, Upasokia. Viharapala, Bihalapala, Piholopalo. Bodhiruchi, Bodhiluchi, Putiluchi. Paramiti, Pat, La, MIT, TI 140, Palomiti. Maheshwara, Mahashula, Emohishulo. Shaneshkara, Shanaishat Chatla, Shinaishachelo. Praise Najit, Patlasainajita, Paloasainashirtu. Mahapadma, Ma, Ha, Pa, Da, Ma 141, Emohopatimo. Udayana, Udayangna, Uchangna. Sangadeva, Sangyeta Ba, Sankaitiapio. Acharya, Achaliya, Ochaliyi. Shakradeva Indra, Shak Kalata Ba Indala, Shirkialotipio Intiolo. Tharni, Dalayane, Taloanai. The admission of the principle that the Chinese pronunciation has changed, and that the recognized Mandarin orthography is nothing more than that of a modern dialect, will be found to throw a light much needed on the use of Sanskrit by the Chinese Buddhists. It is also necessary to recognize the principle, that the Hindu Buddhists in China were men who spoke the dialects of Central India, Northern India, and M. Stanislas Julian's method pour decipher et transcrire les noms Sanscrits makes no allusion to these subjects. The consequence is that all his immense industry has failed to make a window that would have illuminated this dark room. Yet that does not hinder his work from being indispensable to the student on this subject. It gives the Sanskrit words. It gives the modern Chinese pronunciation. These two factors are tabulated alphabetically. The student can with this help proceed rapidly. But if he wish to understand why such and such Chinese characters were chosen, and not prosecute his researches mechanically, he must allow for the influence of dialects and the incessant change of language on both sides of the Himalayas. It is necessary to take the finals of the southern Chinese dialects, and the initials of the dialects spoken in central China at the present time, as our signposts, pointing out to us what was the pronunciation of the Tang dynasty and of the previous age. And this must be done with the addition of aid from the Japanese and Korean transliteration of Chinese sounds, through the spread of Buddhism many centuries ago. It was about 340 years after the death of Mencius, and 550 after the death of Confucius, that the translations from Sanskrit were made. By learning the powers of the Chinese syllabary with the help of the transliterations then made, we can come quite near to the classical age of Chinese literature, and approximate to the actual pronunciation of the great Chinese sages. For the method and proofs, I may here refer the reader to my introduction to the study of the Chinese characters. Particularly is the Sutra of 42 sections worthy of attention, on account of its being the translation of Kashyap and his friend Chuefe-lan. It is highly important for fixing the pronunciation of the Chinese, at the time when they taught Buddhism at Luoyang, in the reign of Ming Ti, AD 58 to AD 76. From their use of characters it is clear, that at that time the modern Fo was but. Olohan was Elahan, Chan, contemplation, was Jian or Dan, Nyepian, Nirvana, was Nitban or Nirban, Kiashi, the name of Kashyapa, Buddha, was Kashyap or Kashyap, Puti, the word Bodhi, knowledge, was Bodhi. Shaman, the Shramana, was Shaman, having about the same sound as now. Paikeu or Paisiu, the Bhikshu, was Baikeu. Chiuchnju, for Godinia, was Godinia. Onahan, a certain grade in discipleship, was Anagam, agreeing with the Sanskrit Anagama. Paichi, for the Sanskrit Pratika, was Paktai, the Pali being Patikan. So it was probably not Pali that Kashyap spoke, though he was a native of central India. Sutio Huan, for Srotapana, another grade of discipleship, was Sotaban or Sudawan. The last of these is the more likely, for the character is the same as that used in writing Nirvana. The Pali is Sotapan, so that the translator did not speak Pali. The greatest initiator of change in the choice of characters was Huayan Sang, about AD 645. He altered the characters according to his opinion of what the selected symbols ought to be. His selection of characters is a gauge of the pronunciation of his time. His translations, however, have not become popular. The older usage of words has kept its place. The language in which the Buddhist sacred writings were first compiled may have been Pali, but that from which they were translated into Chinese was Sanskrit. The Pali books were a separate set of originals. The Sanskrit originals alone are known to the Chinese. The manuscripts, the inscriptions, the charms cut on copper mirrors, the lucky sentences under eaves and over doors in monasteries, are in Sanskrit. And in polyglot books printed at Peking, Sanskrit is the language employed. Köppen, page 186, in saying that the Chinese also have a number of Pali texts, has been misled by Gutzlaff. This missionary had lived in Siam, where Pali is the sacred language, and was there accustomed to the idea that Pali was the original language of Buddhism. This view he brought with him to China, and when he saw Sanskrit inscriptions in the island of Putu, he took them to be Pali. From him the opinion spread, but it is an error. The Buddhists of Burma, Siam, and Ceylon have never spread their religion in China or Japan, or introduced their sacred books into those countries. The Nepal Buddhists preserve the sacred books in Sanskrit, and not in Pali. But Burnouf also found certain portions of the Nepalese books written in Prakrit. The groundwork was Sanskrit. The language occasionally used was Prakrit. The language known by the Chinese as the Fan language was shown to be undoubtedly Sanskrit, by Julian's version of the works of Huayan Sang, the traveler who visited India, and who has described the Sanskrit language in his autobiography. It is the language of Brahma, Fan, Old Sound, Bam. Brahmanical ideas form a strong element in Buddhism. Sanskrit words and Sanskrit writing are peculiarly sacred in the view of the Brahmins. This idea has been borrowed by the Buddhists. They preferred to use the words and writing which were most sacred. With this Shakyamuni would naturally have nothing to do. His instructions were oral. He was a great moral teacher and metaphysical logician. It was his disciples in the centuries that followed him that introduced Sanskrit writing, as the chief medium of recording his instructions. It is they that are responsible also for the charms, and for the faith in magic which stimulated their use. So many Brahmins announced themselves believers in Shakyamuni's doctrines, that Sanskrit became at once a favorite medium for the embodiment of his teaching by writing, even though Shakyamuni himself spoke Pali or Prakrit, as he probably did. In the same way it may be said that Pali was then so extensively spoken, that it was inevitable that it should, in the region watered by the lower Ganges, become also a medium for the preservation of the sacred books. This double form of the sacred books had much to do with the separation that sprang up between the northern and southern schools of Buddhism. The peculiarities of the Chinese transcription deserve to be considered. The Prakrit of the early Chinese translators was, for example, nearer to Sanskrit than to Pali in the sound of prajna, wisdom. The characters adopted are directed to be pronounced patniya. The Pali is panya. There was also in the Prakrit of the early Chinese translators a very clear pronunciation of B for the Sanskrit and Pali V. This is shown by the constant selection of Chinese characters sounded with B or P, according to the old pronunciation. For example, the city Vaishali, near the modern Patna, is spelt Vaishali. The Pali sound is Visali. Drive E.J. Eitel, in his Handbook of Chinese Buddhism, page 27, has said, that Chinese texts consider Pali as the ancient and Sanskrit as the modern form even as regards the system of sounds. If he will direct his attention to these facts, he will perhaps admit that not the Pali, but a certain Prakrit form or forms of the Hindu language, prevalent at the time in central and northern India, was or were at the basis of the Chinese old texts. The Hindu translators in China would have Sanskrit texts chiefly before them, and Prakrit texts occasionally. Their pronunciation was not pure Sanskrit, but was modified by Prakrit peculiarities. In the flourishing period of Buddhism, in the region watered by the Ganges, at the time of the Greek invasion, and afterwards, the art of writing lately introduced was put to extensive use in the Buddhist monasteries. Those institutions fostered education, which was then very much in Buddhist hands. While the people spoke Pali and Prakrit, Sanskrit was the language of education, and hence the fondness shown for it by the Buddhists. Burnouf held that there was a double text, a Prakrit text for the laity and a Sanskrit for the literati. King Kanishk in Kashmir called a council, the fourth, and in the writings edited by this assembly, Sanskrit was the language. The language of Magadha in the time of the Emperor Ashoka was a Prakrit. This was probably much used by the Hindu Buddhists who came to China. An argument against Pali is to be found in the careful selection of Chinese words commencing with sh, to represent the Sanskrit sh, but sh is not a letter known to the Pali, just as it was wanting in the ancient Greek and Latin. The original text of the early Chinese translations before the days of Huayan Sang must have had sh fully developed. It probably dropped ra in Sharira, a relic, and sti in Shrivasti, name of the capital of an ancient kingdom called Kosala, and lying near Kapilavastu. I place here some remarks on Pali, glass, a favorite word. In Buddhist glossaries, the Chinese Pali is derived from the Sanskrit word spatika, crystal. Many of the Hindu Buddhists who came to China, perhaps all, spoke dialects of Sanskrit, but not the Sanskrit itself. The S was dropped, and the final Ka. The T in Ti became L, as in the Turkish Belur. The rock crystal of China comes from Turkestan, and would bring its own name with it from that country. Buddhist makers of glossaries would prefer to derive the word from Sanskrit, as the mother of all knowledge. They have passed over without remark the possibility that the Chinese word may come from the Turkish. The word Pali for glass, formerly pronounced Pali, has been in common use in China since the Tang dynasty. It came in with Buddhism and the international trade with Turkestan. I believe that the initial S in Spatica might be an accretion and not original, just as most probably smelt is later than melt, and sneeze than nose, and stanum than tin. Curiously we find in the Mongol vocabulary bolar, crystal, glass. Bolar de boso, rock salt, buloca chilagon, a polishing stone, a rolling stone used in smoothing the clods of a plowed field. Compare Turkish bilegi, whetstone. Let it be noticed that glass dust is used by polishers and grinders. Whether the Boli or Bali is of Turanian origin and has originated the Sanskrit Spatica, it would be interesting to know. Balar is Arabic for crystal, Spashta is Sanskrit for clear, Barak is Turkish for clear, limpid. Probably here is the root, but who shall decide? In Buddhist magic there has been extensive use of the Sanskrit characters. The doctrine of magic has been developed by the Buddhists very systematically, and to an almost unexampled extent. It arose from the same tendency in the Hindu mind, which produced those vast fictions in the description of the universe, and in the narrative of the past, that distinguished the native literature of that country. The love of the wonderful led the Hindu authors to forsake, at the same time, the fair bounds of history and the sober reality of nature. Here it is easy to perceive a similarity to the Arabians. There is, in their fictions, the same fondness for splendid scenes and striking supernatural effects. This would be poetry were it not very much overdone. The same circumstances of gaudy magnificence are again and again repeated, and the reader is wearied with the unending recital of marvelous events, invented after one model, and whose one object is to excite an undistinguishing admiration of the power displayed. By magic is here meant the supernatural power attributed to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, or claimed by the ordinary priests, and which is exercised by charms, mystic formulae, incantations, finger postures, and such like means. It is not the power of God acting through nature that is here intended, but the power of the priest, through his charms, virtues, and superior knowledge. The magical result is effected by the never-erring retributive fate which is the cause of everything that occurs, and which is responsive in the most complete manner to Buddhist wisdom and goodness. The use of the Devanagari writing for the purposes of magic is an instructive instance of the power of superstition to delude the human mind. The words used by the magician for the most part have no meaning. They are senseless clatter. The sounds are Sanskrit, but the words usually not so. These absurd compositions of unmeaning sounds are of various lengths. They occur frequently in the books of the Great Development. They are engraved on stone monuments on the wayside, on imperial roads, and at places of resort for Buddhist pilgrims. They also form a chief part of the liturgies in use in the monasteries and at funerals. Om Mani Padme Hum is one of the most common. Padme is lotus, Mani is a precious stone, Om is a sacred Hindu symbol. It is written in Sanskrit characters under the eaves of all the Lama temples in Peking. In these temples it meets the eye everywhere. The Tibetan character is based on the Sanskrit. It is also found cut on monuments, both for charms and for intelligible inscriptions. It is the chief language for liturgical use among the Tibetans and Mongol Lamas in Peking, except in two instances. In the Mahakala Miao, the Mongol sacred books are read. In a temple, Phasi, near the hunting park, the Manchu is read. The Chinese Lamas in Peking read Tibetan prayers, while the Chinese priests of the old Chinese Buddhism read, of course, in Chinese. In all these forms, the syllables of the charms are the same. They are written in Sanskrit, or in the other languages mentioned. At the pass called Kuyang Quan, near Peking, there is a stone monument containing a charm in 6 languages, viz., Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, Nuchi, Uyghur, and Mongol. It was cut in the time of the Mongol emperors. It contains the same charm written with the characters employed for all these languages. It was intended as a protection to the emperor in going to and coming from the summer palace, at that time beyond Tushar Keu, and also to all travelers on this much frequented road between China and Mongolia. There are also some monuments inscribed with Sanskrit charms in Peking at the present time, which date from about 700 years ago. They are stone octagonal pillars. One is at the monastery called Huayan, near the Park of the Altar of Heaven and the city gate known as Qiangchamen. These octagonal pillars are called Shichuang, and they are placed in the courts of temples. There is one kept on the premises of the London Missionary Society in Peking. Sanskrit inscriptions are supposed, like pagodas and monasteries, to have a lucky effect on the neighborhood where they are found, and on those who erect them by their benefactions and goodwill. A muttered charm is called Therni, or, in Chinese, Cho. 26. Books and papers that may be consulted for the study of Chinese Buddhism. Among these works may be mentioned the translation of Fo Kuki, or Relation of the Buddhist Kingdoms, by Abel Remusat 142. This work is very fully annotated by Remusat, Klaproth, and Landress. The same interesting book of Chinese travels has been rendered into English by the Reverend S. Beale 143 and also by Mr. H. A. Giles. 144. These 2 translations have not the advantage of abundant annotations. The works of Professor Stanislas Julian on Chinese Buddhism are, 1. Histoire de la vie de Huayan Sang et de ses voyages dans l'Inde, depuis l'an 629 jusqu'en 645. 2. Memoirs sur les contres occidentales, traduits du sanskrit en chinois, en l'an 648, par Huayan Sang, et du chinois en français par S. Julian, 2 volumes, Royal 8 vo. 3. Les Avadanas, Kant, et des Apologues Indians, and These works are characterized by the thorough and exact scholarship of the author. They form a most valuable addition to our knowledge of India and other Asiatic countries in the 7th century, and in the Sung period before that time, during which Buddhism had still the vigor of its youth. Both Fahian and Huayan Sang will be admitted by every candid reader to deserve the reputation for patience in observation, perseverance in travel, and earnestness in religious faith which they have gained by the journals and translations they left behind them. Fahian says, near the end of his narrative, that he sailed from Java in a ship on board of which were about 200 men. They had provisions for 50 days, and were bound for Canton. After a month, a tempest and violent rain almost overwhelmed them. The passengers were all in alarm. Fahian prayed to Kuan Yin, and all the believers in China, to implore of the gods to give them aid and quell the storm. When it became calm, the Brahmins on board said that this Samanian, meaning Fahian, ought to be put ashore on an island, because it was he that had brought on them this hurricane. Why should we all be exposed to danger for the sake of one man? A friend of Fahian said, if you put this Samanian on shore, put me ashore also, or else kill me. If you put this Samanian ashore, on arriving at the land of Han I will denounce you to the king. The king of the land of Han is very much attached to the doctrine of Buddha and honors the monks. The merchants were in doubt what to do, and did not venture on severe measures. The sky continued thickly overcast, and the embarrassment of the mariners increased. They were 70 days on the voyage. Provisions and water began to fail. The cooks took sea water to use in cooking food, the good water they kept for drinking. 2 pints were assigned to each. As the water came near its end, the merchants consulted together, and said that the voyage to Canton ought not to have been more than 50 days. They were long past this time, and ought now to change their course to the northwest, and make for the coast. In 12 days and nights they reached Laoshan 145 on the south shore of the Shantung promontory, and found there good water and beans. After so dangerous a voyage, with such fatigues and so many fears, they arrived at last at this unknown shore. On seeing a plant called Lihotsai, they were convinced that they were indeed in China. This plant was a proof of it, although they met no men nor any traces of men. Some thought they were all near Canton. Others thought Canton was long past. No one knew what part of the coast they had reached. Going ashore in a boat they met two hunters, and Huayan was employed to interpret. From them they found that they were in Tsngchou in the province now known as Shantung, and on the north side of the promontory in the Gulf of Pe-Chi-Li. From this point the merchants found their way to Yangzhou, and Huayan to the capital, Chang'an. This was in the year AD 414. The student has also at his command, a Katina of Buddhist scriptures Front the Chinese, by Samuel Beal. And the romantic legend of Sakya Buddha, by the same. The work of Shat, Über den Buddhismus in Hoc Asian UND in China, contains much valuable information on the contents of Chinese Buddhist books. Written in 1846, it was anterior to the clear drawing of the boundary between Northern and Southern Buddhism by Burnouf, and also preceded by several years the publication of Spence Hardy's works on Singhalese Buddhism, viz. Eastern Monachism, 1840, and Manual of Buddhism, 1843. He says of nirvana that it is the emptiness which every intellectual object will include in itself when liberated. In so far the nirvana is like the original being, before each creative act, but it differs from the original essence in this, that all forms of life and matter come out of the original essence, but cannot come from the nirvana. Because nothing can come from it, and it is incapable of having in it any individuality, mental or material. To the genuine disciple of the Buddhist teaching, to put himself under the mystic and heaven-sent guide to the nirvana, is the alpha and omega of his efforts. Just so to the genuine follower of Confucius, to hold office, to serve the emperor, and become a cabinet minister or censor, constitute his great earthly aim. Our author points out, with great correctness, the relation of Taoism to Buddhism. Buddhism has borrowed nothing from Taoism, while Taoism has borrowed much from Buddhism. After his description of Chinese Buddhism, Shat has added a translation of a work of the school of the Tsingtu or Peaceful Land. This work is also illustrated fully with notes by the translator. It is a well-selected example of current Buddhist teaching in China. The reader of the Tsingtuan, that is the name of the book translated, is informed by the native author, that he is not to expect advantage only in the future life from his study of the books of the school of the Peaceful Land. They are adapted to benefit him in the present life by transforming him into what the book represents as a good Buddhist. The late learned Archimandrite Palladius, resident for many years in Peking as a member of the Russian ecclesiastical mission, was a profound student of Chinese Buddhism. The result of his very extensive reading was embodied in two papers printed in the Researches of the Members of the Russian Mission in Peking. One is a Life of Buddha, the other describes the subsequent philosophical development of Buddhism. These researches have been translated into German. The Handbook for the Student of Chinese Buddhism, by Drive E. J. Eitel 146 is a dictionary of proper names, dogmas, and Buddhist terms generally, arranged alphabetically. The student of Buddhism obtains in this work an important help to his studies. The author has devoted great attention to this subject, and has, in addition to his own investigations, here placed within reach of his readers, many contributions from the immense learning in this department, of Julian, Burnouf, and Koppen. Buddhism is not so powerful in China as to cause alarm to the Christian missionary, in view of the coming struggle which he anticipates. But the history of its introduction, and the nature and extent of the influence it has produced on the Chinese mind and literature, are extremely interesting subjects. The Hindu missionaries tried hard to bring the Chinese to accept the mythology and religious doctrines of their country at the time when it was Buddhist. Their translations abound in Sanskrit words, which it was hoped the Chinese would learn, but this they failed to do. Names of things as well as names of persons, words expressive of doctrines, abstract names, classes of mythological beings, adjectives, arithmetical and astronomical expressions. And many long compound terms are imported in full into the Chinese text. To explain them glossaries were prepared. But they expected more zeal and perseverance in their Chinese neophytes than they have shown, and the consequence is that the glossaries are not looked at. And the Sanskrit names are passed over by the reader of the Chinese texts as an abracadabra which he is glad to miss. Buddha's heart is, for example, spoken of as Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, pronounced in the era of the Hindu translations, Anotala Samamo Sambodhi. And is the negative, Uttara is superior, Sam means perfect, good, same. Samyak is given in the Sanskrit dictionary, all, holy, fitly. Bodhi is intelligence, the intellect, the holy fig tree, knowledge of God, and as an adjective, wise, etymologically it is, that which distinguishes. That is, the intellect, and hence, that which is distinguished, doctrine, the object of the highest study. From this has come the title Buddha, the perceiver, the sage. Whoever will study Buddhism, must know what these and other such words mean, and Dr. Eitel's object has been to provide a handbook in which a mass of information has been collected, adapted to aid the inquirer. In this instance he must look under the words Anuttara and Bodhi. If he is reading a Chinese Buddhist production, he must first consult the Chinese index at the end of the volume. This mode of using the Sanskrit Chinese dictionary is a little cumbrous, but perhaps it is preferable to the perpetuation in a work of this kind of the Mandarin pronunciation, as given in Morrison, Wade, and other authors. Sanskrit books having been translated 14 centuries ago, the powers of the Chinese characters which represented Hindu words have changed in the meantime. As Dr. Eitel justly remarks, to the language then spoken in China no modern Chinese dialect comes nearer in sound than the very Sanskrit or Pali forms themselves. The difficulty might be met, if we had a dictionary of Chinese words with the ancient and modern pronunciations arranged in succession, as in Konghai, but in a more complete form than in that work. For example, if in Morrison's syllabic dictionary, under the syllable fa, between the character and the meanings were inserted old sound, but, Amoy, put, Nanking, fa, Peking, fo. Everyone would thus be in a position to know what the old sounds of the characters are. It would then be feasible to compile a Chinese Sanskrit, instead of a Sanskrit Chinese, dictionary. But as the student of Chinese must also learn to consult works arranged according to the radicals, like Konghai itself, Dr. Eitel's arrangement of the dictionary forms no bar to its usefulness. Among the longer and more valuable articles in this work are those on Kuan Yin or Avalokitesvara, Buddha or Sakyamuni, Samadhi, Sanskrita, Naga, Manjusri, Amitpa, Dhyana, Nagarjuna, Naraka, Triratna, Nirvana, and Trikaya. The spelling here given is that of an author who, somewhat oddly, has followed the French orthography in writing the Sanskrit sounds ch, sh, and j. The best key to the understanding of Buddhism is to be found in the study of the life of its founder. In Shakyamuni himself humanity is first seen, then divinity. A young prince, handsome, strong, heroic, surrounded by pleasures, and tempted by the most brilliant worldly prospects, is deeply affected by observing the miseries of human life. He becomes a changed man, forsakes his father's palace for a hermit's cell, practices and then teaches a rigid asceticism, and dies at 80, after a long career occupied partly with the instruction of a numerous band of disciples, and partly with ecstatic contemplation. He is deified at the moment of death, that is, his disciples elevate him to the summit of humanity, honor him as the best of teachers, and announce that he is forever rescued from the revolutions of life and death. He has entered the nirvana, and when his body has been burned, the sharira, or small reddish residuum, is honored as a sacred relic possessing marvelous powers, and over it a pagoda must be erected. Such a phenomenon, a great and disinterested mind, founding the monastic institute, and teaching multitudes of both sexes and every caste the escape from sorrow to the eternal rest of the nirvana, was sufficient in the condition of Hindu society. As it was 2 centuries before the expedition of Alexander, to account for the early history of Buddhism. In his account of Kuan Yin, Avalokitesvara, our author has gone too far, when he supposes there was a Chinese divinity of this name before the introduction of the Mahayana into China. Nothing is easier than to attach to the imaginary former lives of the great bodhisattvas, any incidents of old biography in any age or country, of a marvelous kind, and adapted to be, in the Buddhist sense, edifying. Such incidents were ascribed by the Chinese Buddhists to the presence of Kuan Yin, nearly as in the Earl of Beaconsfield's Lothair the opportune arrival of a Roman shopkeeper's wife, who shows a benevolent interest in the welfare of that hero, is believed by the Pope and his cardinal to be an appearance of the Virgin Mary. Hence the author of that romance sarcastically describes Lothair as being for a time, in the opinion of everyone in Rome, high and low, the most favored man in this century, yet the net failed to entrap him through his want of faith. Kuan Yin looks on, Kuan, the region, sure, of sufferers whose voices, Yin, of many tones, all acknowledging misery and asking salvation, touch the heart or the pitiful bodhisattva. She looks with 1,000 eyes that she may see them all, and stretches out 1,000 arms that she may save them all. Kumarajiva himself adopted the name Kuan Shirin. The translators of the Tang period, 2 centuries later, brought to view the true etymology as given by our author, but they did not succeed in changing the course of the legend or the name of the divinity. Kumarajiva preferred the more popular and edifying designation. The two meanings, Kuan Tsai and Kuan Shirin, doubtless existed together in Kumarajiva's country, Kashmir, just as afterwards in China. The Mahayana doctrine had prevailed there already for nearly 200 years, from the time of Nagarjuna, given in the Handbook, AD 194. The remarkable extension of the Mahayana literature, Huayan King, Fa King, and in Kashmir, Kashgar, Balkh, and what is now Kabul, aided by the conversion to Buddhism of the Indian Jiti, the Yueti of Chinese history, renders the dialects there spoken early in the Christian era important for the determination of the language employed by the first Hindu missionaries in China. Our author says the Pali was first used, and afterwards the Sanskrit. It would be more correct to say that the Magadha dialect was first used, then the dialect of northern India, such as was spoken in Kashmir, and afterwards the Sanskrit. In the Han dynasty, under Mingtiai, Kashyap Madanga, who came from Magadha, the modern Bihar, used the dialect of that country, which differed from the Pali among other things in retaining from Sanskrit the letter sh. 147 If Kashyap Madanga, the most ancient of the translators, had chosen Chinese words whose initial was S to write the Sanskrit Shramana and Kashyapa, it might be said that he used the Pali. 148 In the Sutra of 42 sections, he used Shaman, and thus originated that name, to be used ever after as the designation of the members of the Buddhist community in China. For Kashyapa he wrote Kaship. The second era of translators, AD 400, was that of Kumarajiva of Kashmir. There can be no doubt that he made use of sh and s as separate letters, for he never confounds them in his choice of Chinese characters. The Chinese words already introduced by his predecessors he did not alter, and in introducing new terms required in the translation of the Mahayana literature, Ta-Siecheng, or greater development, he uses sh for sh, and usually b for v. Thus the city Sravasti was in Pali Savatthi, and in Chinese Shabi-Ati. Probably Kumarajiva himself, speaking in the Kashmir dialect of Sanskrit, called it Shabadi. 2 centuries later, the fashion of close adherence to Sanskrit came into use under the leadership of Huayan Sang. For example, instead of Bikhu, which is like the Pali Bhikkhu, probably also found in the Magadha language, Bitchu, was written, evidently with the intention of restoring the Sanskrit sh. Our author gives a different reason. The great value of such a guide as this handbook in the study of Chinese Buddhism will be understood by the student, when he finds that almost all the important words in doctrine and biography are here traced to their Sanskrit originals, and explained with the aid of recent European criticism. Thus Ho Shang, the most popular term for priest, is Upadhyaya, the president of an assembly or sangha. The 3 precious ones are Buddha, the personal teacher, Dharma, the law or body of doctrine, and Sangha, the priesthood. The term Samme is explained as the samadhi of the original Sanskrit. Samadhi signifies the highest pitch of abstract ecstatic meditation, a state of absolute indifference to all influences from within or without, a state of torpor of both the material and spiritual forces of vitality. A sort of terrestrial nirvana consistently culminating in total destruction of life. He consumed his body by Agni, the fire of Samadhi is a common phrase. The expression Taupayan, arrival at that shore, is explained as the Chinese equivalent of Paramitha, embracing the 6 means of passing to the nirvana. These are, 1. Charity, or giving, dana, 2. Morality, shila, good conduct, 3. Patience, kshanti, 4. Energy, virya, 5. Contemplation, dhyana, 6. Wisdom, prajna. In the account of nirvana, Dr. Eitel touches on a subject of great interest, namely, the expectation of immortality asserting itself in Buddhism, in spite of the overwhelming influence of a metaphysical system adverse alike to the belief in God and to that in immortality. Shakyamuni said in his last moments, the spiritual body is immortal. But he said just before, all you bhikshus, do not be sad. If I lived in the world for a kalpa, on arriving at the time I must still be annihilated. Not to leave you when the hour has arrived is impossible. In gaining benefit oneself, others are benefited. The system of doctrine is already perfect. Should I live longer, it would be of no benefit to you. All that were to be saved, whether in the paradises of the devas, or in the world of mankind, have already been saved. As to those who have not been saved, the causes which will ultimately lead to their salvation have already been put in operation. From this time forward I exhort you, my disciples, to expand, explain, and propagate my doctrine, and thus, here follows our author's quotation, the spiritual body, Phation, of July will be constantly present. And will not be annihilated at all. Much cannot be built on this passage from the Sutra of the Dying Instructions of Buddha, but Dr. Eitel is quite right in arguing the continued existence of the Buddhas from their occasional reappearance after death for the salvation of living beings, and also from the dogma of the Western Paradise. Why, in his article on Dhyana, the author has omitted any reference to the Chn does not appear. He has, however, given an account of the 28 patriarchs, the last of whom, Bodhidharma, introduced into China the Buddhist sect called the Chn, which has played in some respects the same part in China that the Jainas did in India. It has almost supplanted the original Buddhism, and has always made much of the esoteric deposit of doctrine and its transmission along with the robe and rice bowl from patriarch to patriarch. The meaning of the names, however, differs. Jaina means, the conqueror, while Dhyana, the Indian prototype of the Chinese Dan, later Chan, signifies meditation. In the notice of the Nagas there are some interesting references to serpent worship, that very widespread and ancient superstition, which seems to have originated in the first ages, and to have spread from the Babylonian region to the most widely separated countries. The stones of Avebury in Wiltshire, not far from Stonehenge, retain the serpentine shape in which the Druids, or the predecessors of the Druids, arranged them. The Hebrew Naash, Gaelic Nerer, and English snake, are word forms which preserve the old idea, and the account of the temptation in Genesis furnishes us with a probable origin for the traditions of serpent worship among various nations. In Eastern Asia the Nagas were looked on as well disposed. Hence the Burmese confound them with the Devons, while the Chinese regard them as good and powerful and call them Lung, the Greek Draken, and the German Schlange. On the 6 paths of transmigration the reader will find information under the heads Gati, Pretas, Ajura, Amoga, and K. But it is time to stop. Buddhism is a subject which easily ramifies into so many directions, that it is necessary to limit these remarks. Mr. Waters' papers on Chinese Buddhism have been already referred to, in the sketch of the history of Chinese Buddhism in an early part of this volume. They contain a historical summary of Chinese Buddhism, an account of the Buddhas, and a sketch of the Confucianist opposition. Dr. Eitel's valuable 3 lectures on Buddhism, and an article by him on the Nirvana of Chinese Buddhism, in the Chinese Recorder, June 1870, should be consulted by the student. In Buddhism in China, by Reverend S. Beale, the reader will find much to interest. Mr. Beale believed in the Persian influence which produced the legend of Amitabha, and in the Sabaean origin of Sukhavati, Socotra, the island of the blessed. In this he is right. The works of Sir Monier Williams and Dr. Rhys Davids on Buddhism generally are the productions of writers of great erudition and long experience. They naturally throw valuable light on Chinese Buddhism from the Indian side. Sir Edwin Arnold's Light of Asia is a charming poem, which has made Buddhist thought familiar to many readers who knew nothing of it before. Some works from Pali have been translated in the Sacred Books of the East. Such is the number of new publications on the subject of Buddhism, that it is evident the reader has it in his power to obtain a thorough knowledge of this religion. He can test for himself how far it softens manners and teaches kindness, encourages faith in the supernatural, and testifies to the vanity of the world. At the same time he will learn that for the revelation of moral evil and its remedy, of God and of immortality, Buddhism makes no effort that can for a moment compare with the work which Christianity has done for mankind. The end.